The fall rush is upon us. It's back to school season and thousands of young Africans are getting ready for their first international trip alone.
Are you aware that about 14,000 Nigerian students currently study in the United States and many more are willing to do same? Getting the right school and information, however, remains a challenge to prospective students.
With the new academic year set to begin this month in colleges and universities across America, thousands of students from across Africa are getting ready to start their higher education careers in the US. But how prepared are they for the life ahead?
The number one thing is you need to start planning for life after school the very moment you start. So if you start in a 2-year master's program, I know there's a lot that's happening in the first semester or the first couple months, but one of the things you need to add to your plate is start thinking about or start planning for life after the program.
A Ghanaian American college professor, Dr. Karikari, will share with us some of the challenges ahead for the students and tips on how to prepare. And
Je proclame ouvert les Jeux de Paris, célébrant la 33e Olympiade des temps modernes.
let the games begin. The Summer Olympics are in full swing and so are the controversies that come with it. We'll walk you through a few of them. I'm Nia Krofis Matabe. This is the A55 podcast. Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of the A55 podcast in a brand new month. Before we go any further, I have an announcement to make. No, not what you think. We will be wrapping up the first season of this podcast in a couple weeks, but don't worry, we'll be back sooner than you can say flash. So in the meantime, if you're still behind on previous episodes in this season, the break will be a good time for you to catch up before we return. And don't forget to rate our show wherever you listen. Thanks so much to those of you who have already given us 5-star ratings on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And as we take a break, we'd really love to hear from you about what you want to hear in the next season. Hit us up with your comments on our social media platforms. We're at A55pod on X, formerly Twitter, and Instagram. And you can find us by searching for A55 Podcast on Facebook and LinkedIn. Let's get things rolling with some words of wisdom from Tanzania. Here's Gertrude Davison Tete.
Make some money, but don't let money make you.
Thanks, Gertrude. There are so many quotes about the importance of education from so many prominent philosophers and activists that come to mind, but I'm going to cite just a couple of them. The late South African President Nelson Mandela said, quote, "Education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world," unquote. And the great Greek philosopher Aristotle said, quote, "The roots of education are bitter, but the fruit is sweet," unquote. Whichever way you look at it, anyone inspired to pursue higher education is either hoping to taste the sweet fruit of education someday, be it their dream career or, like Mandela said, in their quest to change the world. And for decades, African students have traveled thousands of miles away from their homes to realize this dream of pursuing higher education, whether in the undergrad or graduate levels. The United States continues to rank among the top 5 destinations for international students in the world. According to the statistics website Statista, in 2022, some 948,519 international students from around the world studied in the United States. The UK, Canada and France and Australia rounded up the top 5 for that year. For students from sub-Saharan Africa, Business Insider Africa reports that France was the top destination, hosting nearly 92,000 students from the region in the 2021-22 academic year, ahead of the United States, which had 41,700 students from the sub-region. Making the decision to study abroad does not come easily. For some, it is to have the opportunity and exposure of learning in a different environment than what they are used to. For others, it is because the programs they want to study aren't available in their respective countries. But whatever the reason, there are a myriad of challenges awaiting these students on the other side of the world they are about to call home for the duration of their studies. Dr. Karikari embarked on this journey about 14 years ago, arriving in the United States to pursue a master's degree in communications. Fast forward to today, he's now a professor of communication studies at the Towson University in Maryland in the US. He joins me shortly to talk about the challenges he had to overcome during his time as a student and how he's helping a new generation of international students plan for their studies and beyond in the United States. Eric, thank you very much for joining us on the A55 podcast. You came to the US, I guess, over a decade ago as a student, and I'm wondering if you could tell us what the experience was for you then and how different you think it is now, or if at all there's any difference between being an international student when you came and being an international student today.
Sure. First of all, thanks for the opportunity to chat with you and me. I appreciate your podcast. I appreciate the work you're doing. So thank you and keep it up.
Okay, I'll do my best.
All right. So I have been in this country for 14 years because I came here to do both my master's and my PhD. I had done my undergrad at KNUST. I did my national service, and then after my national service, I came in 2010. I went to Minnesota. I did my master's over there, and then I took a year off to do what we call OPT, which is the work authorization thing. And then after that, I started my PhD, and I did that for 4 years. So the first 8 years, 7-8 years I was still in my student status, right? Let me just first speak to like my own experiences. When I first came, it was very challenging in ways that every international student you will talk to would agree, right? I don't think that my experience was unique in that sense. It was challenging in the sense that you don't have family, right? I was a young man at the time, and I left my family for the very first time in my life. I left my entire continent. And so when I came and I went to Minnesota, which has a reputation of being cold, and this is not just a reputation. It really is cold over there. So just imagine going from the depths of the tropics to Minnesota by myself. And then there was also being thrown into a graduate program, which by itself is not easy to handle, right? And of course I was poor, right? I didn't have money. I mean, I had an assistantship, but the assistantship, anyone who has had one knows that it covers the basics, and beyond the basics you have no money, right? Like I wasn't going to bed hungry, but I had no extra money to do any other things. So there was that, right? And there was, I mean, I remember there were times when I had to call my parents embarrassingly because I had told myself, you know, I am finally a man, I don't need to rely on my parents anymore. And then here was I 6 months later calling them because I'm broke, right? Oh, I guess there's something unique about me. I had said there was nothing unique. But the uniqueness of mine was that I had come from a science background, from my undergrad to humanities and social sciences.
Chemistry. Yeah.
Chemistry. So so my undergrad was in chemistry, and then that's a whole nother podcast. And then I ended up in communication. And so one of the things that I remember very vividly from my very first year was grappling with catching up, because I had very little, almost no communication experience in terms of even academic experience, right? I was determined to succeed. So I was spending I don't even know how many hours a day in the library trying to read and catch up and do my assignments and all of that, right? I guess what I'm trying to say is that it was a very tumultuous time in my life, but I would do it all over again because I have the benefit of hindsight now, knowing where all of that has led me.
But the question is, would you do it differently this time? That was why I asked if you think the experience has changed since you came in 2010 and what it is.
I think the experience has changed. I would do it. I would do it differently in the sense that, I mean, there are some details about like where, for instance, I would have gone. You know, like I would go to a place where there was some kind of social support. I did get a lot of social support eventually because I was in a university that had a healthy African student community. We were by no means a majority, but there was African students that were really supportive while I was there. And some of those friendships that I formed all those years ago are still existing today. And so that was a good thing. I think we don't think about that enough when we are making those decisions about where to go to school or even where to live, being able to know people who live there, who have similar experiences to you, similar background, similar culture, and getting the kind of support that you need from. Sometimes all you need is for someone who speaks your language.
Because it can be lonely.
Right? Yes, absolutely. Right. So sometimes that's all you need. Someone who speaks your language, someone who understands how you're feeling or what you're feeling. But if I did it again, I mean, I would do it again, but I would maybe do it slightly differently. But to the question of whether or not the experience is similar now, I think the experience, well, it's similar now, it's not the same. I think that 14 years on, it's more difficult now.
So?
I think that I had it easier than grad students who just arrived like I did 14 years ago. I think the reason I would say that is that things are more expensive now everywhere, right? So whether you're coming from Ghana or you land somewhere here, like things are more expensive now. But I also think that in terms of the general experience of being here, I think, and this varies by where you are, but also things like racism and things like discrimination, that varies by geographical location, right? Especially in this country. And so I think that that's one of the things that students might find different depending on where they are. But I think overall, the precarity, the level or degree of precarity is higher now than it was back then. Like now, students are also having to deal a lot with things that we didn't have to worry too much about. There's all of the post-pandemic world that we live in is very different from the pre-pandemic world, right? And of course, we're dealing with climate change, right? Which is also one of the things that makes life a little more precarious, because it's different dealing with these things when you have money in your pocket, right? Versus you're dealing with all of these things and you're still a poor graduate student.
Or even your money is not enough to take care of the things you need to take care of.
Yeah, right. But also, if I go back to think about, like, even the process of getting here is worse than when I was leaving Ghana. Right now, because of the work I'm doing, I talk a lot with graduate students and potential graduate students who are in different countries, not just Ghana. You know, I am the director of a graduate program where we recruit from everywhere. And the conversations that I am having with students and prospective students are telling me that I had it a little easier. And I thought back then it was hard, right? For instance, getting a visa, going through the process, getting here is worse now. Even students with assistantships are getting denied visas from places like Ghana and Nigeria because of how many students are applying, right? I remember my time, it wasn't such a big deal. All you needed was a credible program. You got an admission to a credible program and you have a good reason to attend the program. You have a goal, whatever, and you go for your visa, right? Of course, there were people who were denied back then too, but the rates of denial were much higher now is what I hear, right? So that's one of the things that makes a little bit more difficult. Even the pre-arrival procedure is a little bit more precarious than it is today. But overall, I would say that even though it's not the same, it is very similar. The experience once you get here is very similar, right? We have to grapple with the same things. If you come as a grad student, you're going to be poor unless your family is rich. Then hallelujah.
But one of the things also which I want us to talk about in terms of challenges is even after you are done with the studies, because typically the assumption is once you're done with your studies, the jobs are easily available and then you can just go like that and get one. But the reality on the ground is very different. That is not what the situation is. I mean, I can attest to that. How do you tell the students you interact with how to navigate that? Because the solution some people have found is, okay, from the master's I'll do a PhD like you did, but there's still no guarantee even after your PhD that you're getting a job.
Yeah. The number one thing that it's almost a song I sing to them is you need to start planning for life after school the very moment you start. So if you start in a 2-year master's program, I know there's a lot that's happening in the first semester. But one of the things you need to add to your plate is start thinking about or start planning for life after the program. Because the 2 years happen very quickly, relatively, right? And so if you don't start planning for, okay, what am I going to do? How am I going to find a job? Or if I want to go back, what is the plan for going back? Because I know people who've gone back and they didn't find what they wanted or they didn't find anything. Or I know people who stayed and it hasn't worked out for them and eventually gone back. Like all kinds of situations, right? And I'm not going to say that those people did not plan. I'm just saying that one of the things that would reduce the certainty that you're going to struggle after school is that you should start thinking about it, at least start thinking about it right away. So I keep telling students, once you get here, as soon as you settle down, start thinking about, okay, this program that I'm doing, what is my plan for it? Of course, that's something you would have already thought about before you started. But even while you're doing it, practically, how is that going to translate into the real world? How is that going to get you what you need or what you want, right? What kinds of jobs, for instance, are there around that? What are the pathways to getting these jobs? You are an immigrant. You need the paperwork. You need to have a legal working status to be able to live here. So what are the pathways for doing that legally? Or like I said, if you want to go back, what is your plan for going back? You have, somewhere you think or avenue for utilizing your expertise when you go, things like that. You can say, oh, I'm just going to wait till after my first year and then I'll start thinking, no. And
by the end of your first year, you're already neck deep in your thesis, and for you to be able to actually be given that degree that shows that you really studied. So there's no time to think about anything else.
Right. And first of all, the United States is the most litigious country on the planet. So it is very difficult because of that to navigate the legal landscape in this country, especially by yourself as an international student or immigrant, which is why planning early is very, very important, right? Sometimes you need lawyers. Sometimes even if you're doing it yourself, you need to figure out, where do I go to find the right paperwork? All of that takes time, right? You can't wait till a few months before you graduate to start working on these things. As someone who has a PhD, I don't think everyone needs a PhD. We can all be productive in what we are doing. Of course, there are some things that you would need a PhD for because PhD program, is very specific to certain things. And that's one of the things you might have to determine, right? Depending on what field you're in or where you want to go. Do I need a PhD? If you need a PhD, it takes 8 or so months to successfully apply to a PhD program, right? And so you can't just decide 3 or 4 months before you graduate that you want to do a PhD, right? You need to decide at least a year before, right? And do your research about programs and talk to people. Sometimes you have to even go physically to visit programs, and all of that stuff takes time. If you decide not to do a PhD because it's not needed for your field or for where you want to go, there's still a lot of planning involved. Finding work, where to work, making sure that you have the right paperwork, if it's H1B or whatever, like all of these things, everything involved in life after your education takes time. Sometimes it takes money too.
Always.
Actually, often takes money.
Always.
But it absolutely takes time. So that's the one thing I keep telling people. Give yourself the benefit of time. Don't wait till a few months before. You're going to be really hot, right? And some of these lessons I learned from people who mentored me. Some of them I learned the hard
because
way.
I was just going to go to that. You've been mentioning PhD for a while. You have one. Like you said, you came to do the master's. Was it your plan to go into academia or to even do a PhD before you came or shortly after you came? Because from what you're saying, you need to plan like a year ahead even before you enroll in a PhD program.
Absolutely. So I did not have a plan.
So how did you end up doing it?
Before I left Ghana. So the story is that when I decided to do COM, I actually decided to do COM like almost immediately after I graduated from my undergrad. I did my national service at Kolebu. So I spent half my time in the central lab at Kolebu, and then the other half in the chemical pathology department. I did not like the job. I just couldn't see myself doing this. And it's not to pigeonhole chemistry, because chemistry is so broad that I could have done a million other things with it. I just, at that time, I was like, I can't see myself doing this. I need something where I would interact with more people. And so that was my experience. But even before that, I was also thinking about, if I don't continue with chemistry, what are my passions, right? And my passions had always been communicating ideas, presenting, writing, all of that stuff, starting from high school when I was on the editorial board. And I was also on the editorial board in the College of Science at the University. So I had done all of that work, and I was like, maybe I should look at something with like writing or communication, and so I started looking at communication. I started looking at programs on the internet, and then I think I made my mind up at that point, and the rest is history. I applied, blah, blah, blah. Communication is also really broad, and one of the sub areas of communication that attracted me before I even applied was corporate and organizational communication. And at the time, I was also trying to think practically too, like what am I going to do with the communication degree? And at the time, the corporate comm landscape in Ghana was very vibrant, and it was growing. I'm talking 2009, 2010, right? And so there was a lot of companies that had come in to Ghana who were looking for corporate communications professionals. Existing companies were growing their corporate communications departments. So I was like, I'm just going to go do it. Because at the time, there was no corporate communication program in Ghana. Okay. Not that I remember. All of the communication programs were more media, PR, journalism. And I wasn't interested in that side. I was more interested in the corporate comm side of it. So I came and I did my master's. And while I was doing my master's, maybe I would say at the end of my first year, maybe, that was when I realized that, you know what, I don't want to go back right now. I want to do a PhD. And there's something to be said about mentoring, right? So I had a very good mentor. Well, he's still a mentor, an African-American professor I had who is now a friend. And he was the one he didn't tell me to do a PhD, but just like the conversations we had. And so he's like, you're very good at this research thing. You write very well. You articulate ideas very well. And this research thing is natural to you. Why don't you do a PhD? And you're a good teacher, right? And so I was like, well, I guess maybe I should do a PhD. It was also around that time that the vibrancy that I had seen in the corporate communications landscape in Ghana kind of started dying down. And so I was like, maybe not the right time to want to go back to Ghana. If I can do a PhD here, let me do a PhD and see. I mean, I still wanted to go to Ghana. I wasn't one of the students who never wanted to go back. I mean, there's legitimate reasons to not want to go back. But I was one of those that really thought that I would go back and live in Ghana and all of that stuff. But I didn't. And I did my PhD and I found pathways to citizenship and all of that. But I think that one of the things that people need to hear is that you don't need to have the best sense of what is going to happen. You just need to have a plan going into it. My plan when I first started has changed very radically, but it doesn't mean that I shouldn't have come with a plan. And so even though I had a very specific plan, I came in, that plan changed, and I would say it changed for the better. And I'm enjoying success professionally now, right? More than I even imagined I would. But on a very practical level, for immigrants, and I'm not just talking about immigrants from Africa, I'm talking about immigrants to the United States from everywhere. Doing a PhD is one of the pathways to citizenship. That's the truth, right? Because it's easier to get a job, first of all, right? If you have a PhD, but it's also easier to make the case for getting like a legal status in the country.
Okay. So I was going to go to, since we were talking about research, I wanted to talk about at least one of your researches, but if you could briefly tell us, what were the challenges you faced when you branched into academia full-time to teach? Because Ghana's educational system is vastly different from the one in the US. So I'm just curious, how did you manage to blend in, if that's the right word to use?
So the good thing for me, which a lot of people don't get that benefit, my first assistantship was not a teaching position. So in my master's program, I had mentioned that I had an assistantship, but that wasn't a teaching position. It was a combination of some administrative work, and I was also mentoring a cohort of undergraduate students, right? I didn't have to formally teach. I took on some teaching responsibilities, but not in any formal role. I didn't have my own classes to teach or anything like that. And so in that sense, I was eased into the teaching bit, as opposed to a lot of people I know who, when they have an assistantship, they are literally coming from Ghana last week, and 2 weeks later they're in the classroom teaching American students.
Which is why I asked your experience, because it just blows my mind to think of coming from one totally different educational system into another one and just going to teach there.
Right. So that's the case for a lot of people. My first official teaching was during my PhD program, by which time I had already been in the country for 4 years. It was still a challenge. Let's be frank, it's still a challenge.
Teaching isn't easy after all.
But it's better now. It was really intense when I first started in the classroom. But one of the things that experience does is that it helps you deal with, or I guess sometimes mask those kinds of things, those kinds of challenges. And so obviously the way that I see myself now, I'm much more confident in the classroom, and I have a much better rapport with students in the classroom now than 10 years ago when I started teaching.
So your areas of expertise, I looked you up a bit, which I usually do for all my guests. And you've actually said your master's was in organizational communications, and it also includes leadership communications and then critical or cultural studies. And I noticed from your bio that you take a critical approach to race or ethical and globalization in communication. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing some of your findings from this particular study, or maybe any other research you've done with us.
Right. So if you took an aggregate of my research from the past 5-6 years, this is what it would look like, right? So that description you just gave is what my research would look like. All my research has been focused on looking at communication in organizations from the perspective of traditionally marginalized groups, right? So,
but why is that important to you, though? Is it because of your background?
Yes, absolutely. You know, when I was in Ghana, and even here, right, there's a lot of people who make the argument that the researcher should be distanced from their research. Research should be neutral in that sense. Like you should be so far away from your research so you can be neutral and objective and all of that. And I call BS on all of that, because how can you do research that you are not personally invested in? How can you do research that you're not passionate about? How can you do research that in some way, shape, or form does not impact you personally? I tried that, it did not work. Since then, I decided I'm not going to do research that has nothing to do with me, with who I am. I am a Black person in the United States, and that itself is a very complicated description, right? But I'm also all these other things that I want my research to be able to touch these things that are important to me, to my identity, right? So when I looked at globalization in my work, I look at globalization both as a practical phenomenon and as a theoretical one. Globalization affects me more than it does other people because of where I come from, Ghana. But when I look at things like race and ethnicity, and I look at things like class, economic class, these are things that are relevant to my identity, and I am more interested in how, for instance, people who look like me or come from my part of the world are positioned within certain organizational spaces. You know, a lot of research, including my own, will tell you that Black people are less likely to rise all the way to the top in organizations, and especially worse for you if you're a woman as well, right? And so why is this, right? So I'm curious about these questions, right? Why does this happen? And so those are some of the things that from a communication standpoint. I want to understand, I want to examine, I want to sometimes even ask more questions about it.
So it seems to me like it's not a one and done research for you as far as these issues are concerned. There are things you still have questions. So I'm guessing we're going to see more from you when it comes to these conversations in corporate communications, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, you've given great information so far, especially when it comes to studying abroad as an international student. So I'm going to attempt to sum up what I remember, especially for those who are thinking about coming into the US. You need to do your research. Research the location, the school, the program. Make sure it's something you're interested in, something that whether you decide to stay or go home, it's something you could use either which way. And another important thing to look out for in your research is social support, correct? All right. And then what else? Give one or two more that probably I haven't mentioned.
I would add, find good mentors. I really took mentoring for granted. I did.
Well, because we don't come from a culture where we have mentors usually.
No. I think, yeah, you're right. We culturally take mentoring for granted.
We do it without calling it.
I don't know. I think we do. We just don't. Exactly. We don't label it like that, right? And so I think that I took it for granted that I was just going to have people who will help me. And we also come from a culture that's very, I hate this term, but that's the best way to say it now, collectivist, right? And so we take for granted that there's people around. There's people in your family, your uncles, your parents, your grandparents, sometimes even your neighbors, right? And your friends from church and other places. Like everyone is going to help you somehow, give you some advice or pull you in. Like we are surrounded constantly by all these people. And I grew up very much like this. And so because of that, I took mentoring for granted until I came to this country and I was like, oh, there's literally nobody around. There's nobody around who's going to tell me something, give me a piece of wisdom. And so when eventually I found good mentors that were really helpful, and these are not people who just told me things, they would hold your hand and they would do it with you. They would open doors for you. I told myself, I'm never going to take mentoring for granted again. So that's the advice that I give people. Find mentors who are passionate about you so that they can help you to do what you want to do, right? And I just can't emphasize that enough. And I guess the other thing I would say in addition to that is work hard. It's very cliche, but I can't say enough how hard you need to work. And as someone who I see myself very much as a critical scholar, I acknowledge that sometimes and often hard work itself is not enough because there are other forces that are fighting against you. But often hard work means resilience. And so even though things might not be as wonderful as you would like them to be, that you keep pushing, you keep working hard, you are grateful often. But I don't want to be misconstrued. Let me add this. Be grateful, but demand your due. I'm not saying be grateful. Ghanaians, we are very needy. I don't want Ghanaians to think that me saying be grateful means that you should just take whatever, lay down and take it, right? You have to, sometimes you have to stand up for yourself or stand up for other people. Don't be grateful for the crumbs because you are worth more than the crumbs. Be grateful for like actual good things that are happening to you and not being grateful, because like in this country, Black people have been told a lot about just being grateful that they are not slaves anymore. And like, that's not what I mean. Like, I don't want to be a slave, but I also don't want to get the crumbs off the table. I want what is due me. And so that's what I mean when I say be grateful, is that be grateful for the good things that are happening to you or happening for you and the community that you have and the people around you and opportunities that you get, right? But not to lay down and let people walk all over you.
Wow, Dr. Karikari, thank you so very much for your time. And we are grateful that you accepted our invitation to come on the show today.
This was fun. Thank you so much for inviting me.
While we wish all incoming freshmen the very best in their academic journeys, I also want to remind them of one of the points made by Dr. Karikari, which is start planning for your post-graduation life and or career now before you even set foot in the classroom. It's that time of the year when thousands of athletes converge for 16 days to show how hard they've been working since their last appearance on the world's spectacular sports stage. And as always, there's never a shortage of drama. Before You Go is next. And before you go, if I had my way, the Olympics would be held every year instead of every 4 years. I mean, waiting for that long is way too stressful for me. And so, believe me when I tell you, I'm super hyped right now that the Olympics are finally underway in Paris. But as has become the norm, unfortunately, each Olympic Games comes with its own set of stories that both athletes and superfans like myself would rather do without. So let me attempt to recap a few of them. Let's start with the men's football or soccer event which happened days before the opening ceremony. A match between Morocco and Argentina descended into chaos when Moroccan fans ran onto the field and threw bottles to protest a late goal by Argentina. That halted the match for nearly 2 hours. The fans were kicked out of the stadium, the goal was reviewed by VAR and was determined to be an offside, so the players had to play the last couple of minutes or so in front of an empty stadium, and the score was revised down to 2-1 instead of 2-2. In women's football, a spy drone scandal caused Canada to lose its coach ahead of their game against New Zealand, which Canada won, by the way, 2-1. New Zealand officials had reported that a drone was flying over their training ground. The drone was struck down and of course it was found to be flown by a team member on Team Canada. They apologized for the incident after investigation proved they were indeed spying on New Zealand, and the head coach and 2 other staffers were sent home. Talk about sending people home, Japan caused a stir when the captain of their female gymnastics squad voluntarily withdrew from competing for violating the code of conduct for the squad. Now, each country has a set of rules for its athletes during the Olympic Games, and it turns out Shoko Miyata, that's the captain, fell short of these rules. What did she do? She smoked and drank alcohol. Apparently in Japan, the legal age for consuming alcohol or smoking is 20, but Miyata is 19. But officials said it wasn't as much an issue of her age as it was an issue of breaking the rules for the squad. And guess what? Japan qualified for the team finals in the female gymnastics, but finished at the bottom of the table. Whew. That was just a bit of recap I could squeeze in, but there is a lot more happening at the games, and well, I'll try to do another roundup on the next episode. But that's it for this episode. A big thanks to Dr. Karikari for joining us today. Thanks as always to my producer Gertrude Davison Tete and to Bright Dra, our social media coordinator. Our theme music is Sunshine Blues by Kobe Spikey. I'm Nia Krofi Smatabe. Have a great weekend, and let's meet here again in 2 weeks to wrap up season 1.